Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's DCRI Research Conference. We have a special session today with a panel of speakers, a distinguished list of mentors and mentee, former star mentees. First is Gillian Sanders-Schmidler, who is an associate professor. We also have Tracy Wang, who's going to join, who's also an associate professor. Sana Al-Khatib will join the discussion at the end. And Prateeti is one of our star fellows. There's somebody else who was involved but couldn't be here, Matt Crowley, who's an assistant professor of endocrinology and metabolism. So they're going to talk about something actually that I'm very excited about. Usually when we talk about mentor-mentee relationships, it's in the absence of data. It's a lot of advice without any data. And what we get to hear about today is actually some wonderful results from some of their work examining sort of the distinction between training experiences and then what people go on to do and where the gaps are and what we might be able to do better. This is in the context of cardiovascular outcomes, which I think is a good example, but certainly applicable to, I think, training in all facets of medicine. So please join me in welcoming them today. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so as Uptil said, I'm going to talk about training outcomes research, and we did focus on cardiovascular researchers, but we also solicited input from other outcomes researchers, and so tried to make it a little broader. And this is some work that's funded by the NHLBI, and it's part of the Center for Cardiovascular Outcomes Research that the coordinating center is here at DCRI with Eric Peterson as the PI, and Tracy is very involved in this coordinating center and grant, and it's a project that is as part of that larger effort. As Uptil mentioned, we're going to be talking about some work where really Prateeti and Matt, as two of the junior investigators, have really done a lot of the work and bringing things together. So I'm going to, in a few moments, turn it over to Prateeti to talk about her section, and then Matt unfortunately couldn't be here today, and so I'll talk about his findings. And then we'll hopefully get some feedback from the group. We are at the point where we're really trying to digest a lot of our findings and think about next steps and some recommendations we can be making to NHLBI, and so we'd love some input from the group. So the project objectives is we're looking to determine the current training experiences and the variation in these experiences for early stage cardiovascular investigators across the US. And then also look to see if we could determine the needed skill set to become a successful independent investigator in cardiovascular outcomes research. And then, ideally think about what are the needed changes to the training and opportunities that we're giving our early investigators to address any of the mismatch between these two areas. So we're first going to start looking at this first objective of the current training experiences. And how we did that is we wanted to say, what is the current training experience of early stage investigators? And we've done this by looking at a survey of mentees and mentors across the US. We tried to target as broad a group as we could, and we used a bunch of different mechanisms to do that. So one was that in the second stage, which I'll talk about kind of Matt's work, we have a list of successful grantees going from 2010 onwards that are looking at research that could be applicable here and outcomes research for early investigators. So we have successful grantees from the NHLBI, from the VA, from PCORI, and from AHRQ, and we solicit their participation in the survey. So these are folks that have actually received K awards, received other types of grants, and have had some level of success. We then also targeted members of the Q-Core conference that were attending there. We had the folks that were involved with the C-Core grant, the larger C-Core grant. Those are the early stage investigators. We also targeted people that were participating in an NHLBI T32 program or one of the VA's HSR&D programs, as well as the AHA Roundtable program. So as much as we could go out to all those different mechanisms and get as much response as we can. And then the topics that we covered in the survey, we tried to ask both the mentees and the mentors similar questions, getting information about their demographics, their clinical training and specialty, the training that they had available at their institutions, and then the training that they would like to have at their institutions, and focusing on a set of competencies that have been defined, I think originally was defined by the CTSAs as competencies that you need to be an effective comparative effectiveness researcher. We looked at career goals, both in terms of where they would see themselves in terms of location, as well as the the breakdown of research versus clinical requirements, asked them questions related to their funding plans and success and optimism, targeting their mentorship satisfaction, and then some overall questions related to their optimism in the field and how prepared they felt for going forward. So that's kind of the general overview of the surveys, but I'm going to turn it over to Prateeti to actually tell you a little bit about what we found and what we think we're seeing in these results.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. So from our survey, in terms of results, we had 185 mentees answer the survey and 76 mentors. And in terms of the mentee characteristics, we had about half women, half men. The average age for the group was in their 30s, so most of them, about 60% or more, were in their 30s somewhere. In terms of stage of training and career, most of them were at least, some part after their training, at least 3 to 10 years after their training. And then most of them were clinical. About 80% or so were clinical, with a 50-50 split between cardiology and non-cardiology. So in terms of the mentor split, there were slightly more women than men in terms of the people who answered the survey. Most of them, there was kind of a bimodal distribution in terms of the time since completing training. About 30% had completed training 10 to 14 years ago, and then 36% were 20 plus years out of training. Most of them were either associate or full professors, and most of them were clinical non-cardiology mentors, and most of them mentored 2 to 4 mentees. In terms of career paths, we asked both mentees and mentors what the career paths were. Mentees, when they were entering training, answered. Oh, perfect. Mentees, when they were entering training, which is outlined in blue, were saying that they were mostly going to be academic, and it seemed like they were also planning on being academic post-training. And then if you look through in terms of mentors, the mentors' descriptions of their mentees' career paths, most of them felt like their mentees were going to be academic. Okay. And then there was a little bit of discrepancy between the mentees and mentors, but overall we don't really know if they were from the same institutions or not. In terms of research mentorship, mentees were asked about their experience with research mentorship, and most of them were satisfied, felt like they had enough time for research, felt like they had received appropriate training and methodology, felt like they had gained leadership skills and had access to data, and had developed some level of independence from their mentors. They were also asked if they had difficulty finding mentorship in their area, and most of them disagreed with that statement, meaning that most of them felt like they had adequate access to mentors. Some of the comments we got were that they felt that appropriate mentorship is a huge problem. There's no oversight, and a lot of mentorship malpractice occurs. One person said it's hard to find a good mentor to work with, particularly if you're not at a research institution. And one person said that at the major centers that do cardiovascular outcomes research, the opportunities for training are wonderful. However, there are only about 5 of them that have a critical mass of mentors and infrastructure. People at other centers are largely left out, which is problematic for developing the next generation of outcomes researchers. Now, all these comments are somewhat negative, but if you think about it, a lot of people who would put in comments are probably going to put things that are not as positive. In terms of cardiovascular outcomes research compared to 5 years ago, mentees were asked to compare their experience compared to 5 years ago. They felt like compared to 5 years ago, there was a greater need for outcomes research now. In terms of funding, they didn't feel like that was as positive. They did feel like there were training opportunities and that the ability to succeed has been negatively impacted by funding cutbacks. When you look at mentors, they had a similar distribution in terms of greater needs for outcomes researchers, but that funding cutbacks had taken place and that there were still training opportunities available, but that their ability to succeed had been negatively impacted by the funding cutbacks. And if you compare this to the previous one with mentees, you see that the mentors are slightly more concerned about the funding cutbacks. In terms of optimism for a career in cardiovascular outcomes research, over 50% of mentees were very optimistic about their ability, their optimism for a career in cardiovascular outcomes research. And mentors were also optimistic, but if you look at the bar graphs, overall, the mentees were slightly more optimistic than the mentors. In terms of optimism by mode of funding, mentees were fairly confident that they could get funding from their own institution, much more so than the mentors. And if you look through, mentees were overall more optimistic about the modes of funding with every category other than the VA. And overall, many people felt like they could get funding through industry, things like AHA, the VA, and mentees felt like they could get it from their own institution. In terms of comments about funding, people felt that in general the outlook for young investigators is horrid. It's difficult to maintain optimism when NIH funding rates are incredibly low. And one person said that my concern is that there are a number of junior early career investigators who are or soon will be transitioning from career development awards to investigator-initiated grants. I worry that the funding cutback will have a more significant impact at this critical K to R transition. So briefly, I wanted to show you NHLBI funding by year. If you look at the funding actually went up in the early 2000s and plateaued in the mid-2000s, went up briefly in 2010, and has been rather steady and gone down a little bit in recent years. However, the number of people that we're actually training has gone way up. So if you see in 2003, the total number of applications and the people who are being trained in outcomes research has gone up, and the success rate for these funding grants has gone down. We asked both the mentees and the mentors in terms of time spent on research, and it looked like most people currently had and also desired greater than 50% time dedicated to research. We also asked mentors more specific questions about their early career, current researchers, and future researchers. In their early career, most of these mentors felt like they had greater than 50% time dedicated to research. They felt that current researchers should have greater than 50% training in research. And then they also felt like future researchers should have greater than 50 or even greater than 75% time dedicated to research. In terms of preparation for success, we asked both mentees and mentors their level of how prepared early investigators were for success in terms of multiple categories, including job career satisfaction, ranging all the way to work-life balance. In terms of job career satisfaction, most people felt like they were pretty well trained and were prepared for success in terms of job career satisfaction. Mentees overall felt like they were fairly prepared. Mentors felt like they were preparing their mentees very well for things like publications, research funding, promotion, leadership in local and regional areas. And the mentors felt like they were preparing their mentees a little bit more than the mentees felt like they were prepared. In terms of comments, for career optimism, some people said that the funding environment is so hostile that job satisfaction is not even an option if you don't have support to do the job itself. If there's a funding difficulty, then I see myself pursuing a more semi-academic job where one practices significant clinical medicine with a smaller research one. I will try academics, but have a low threshold to switch to private practice if I don't get funded. And some of the mentor comments were that a large number of early to late career researchers at my institution have left for hard money teaching jobs or industry because soft money positions are seen as having too little job security, too much stress, and requiring too much uncompensated effort. There are more funding opportunities in cardiovascular outcomes research, but there are also more investigators and trainees in that area competing for funding, kind of reflecting what the graphs I had shown earlier. Everyone talks about work-life balance, but no one seems to know how to achieve it while also achieving academic success. The faculty, self-included, do not set a good example for this. And it has been interesting to see how former trainees who go into industry, not drug or device companies, but companies doing outcomes research, may have more opportunity to focus on research than those who pursue the academic route. So, brief summary of our survey findings. Mentees were equally split by sex, with equal numbers of men and women, greater than 3 years post-training, and mostly clinical. Mentors were more likely female, slightly more likely female, mostly 20 years post-training, associate or full professors, more likely to be clinical, and they were mentoring 2 to 4 people. Most people in the survey entered into training as academicians and left training with the same goal. There was a general sense of optimism regarding mentorship and preparedness. And optimism was decreased with regards to funding, though mentees were more optimistic than mentors. So overall, there is this view of looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, and people are generally more optimistic despite the comments that we read.
So before we turn over to the second part where we're looking at kind of the funded things, I did want to stop and see if anyone had any questions or comments specific to the first section or anything that you found surprising in what we were seeing. Just wanted to pause for a moment. No? Oh, yeah.
I'm kind of interested.
Oh, is it?
I don't think it's ceiling, right? So I'm kind of interested in the distribution of the characteristics of both the mentors and the mentees, and wonder, do you have information on the people that you actually sent the questionnaire to? How many responded, and do you feel like this distribution is representative of the people who were asked to answer the questionnaire?
Right. Well, so there was a couple problems. So we, for the ones that we personally sent out requests to, we do have the distribution on, well, at least their institution through kind of where their email addresses are and things like that. We don't, I mean, we can make guesses about their gender, but we can't know for sure. Unfortunately, when we sent, the AHA sent out for us to all the QCAR attendees, and we know how many they sent out to, but we don't know the overlap from their list with our list. You know, I mean, obviously with the mentors having over 50% women, there's certainly not over 50% women in the mentor cardiovascular outcomes research, and I think kind of as a broader perspective. So, you know, we haven't yet got a good handle of how representative this is. And we are, you know, these are people that answered the survey. So in some ways, those might be people that were either happy with things and wanted to say it, or else had, you know, issues and wanted to get it across. We don't know which way that would bias things. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So the next part of the project was really looking to see what the needed skill set was. And how we did this is we wanted to look at, okay, well, what is getting funded currently? And really, what are the different methods that are being used in those grants, and are we actually training people for these methods? And now, one thing that to keep in mind here is all the data that we're looking at are going to be based on grants that are actually funded. And what we don't have information on, and we tried to get, but it didn't really work out, was on the grants that get submitted that don't get funded. And so we don't know, we're going to talk about the things that are getting funded and the methods that they're representing, but we don't know if the people are, all the grants that didn't get funded, what methods those represent. So we can talk a little bit about what that means in terms of what we're able to say or not say. So we looked at successful grants for 2010 onwards. We wanted to target grants that early stage investigators in cardiovascular outcomes could actually apply for and be interested in getting funded. And so we looked at specifically from NHLBI, AHRQ, and VA, their early stage investigator grants. So for NHLBI, we focused on the K23 and K01s. For HRQ, it was their K08s and K08s, and then the VHSR&D, their Career Development Awards. But since PCORI is certainly a place where people are applying for grants right now in outcomes research, we included these grants in our data set. But the PCORI grants do not have an early stage investigator category, and so we're not able to focus purely on those ones. So when we look at the results, we're going to do it for all successful grants, and then we actually take out the PCORI ones and look at it as a subset. So we have 521 grants. We then wanted to look at the ones that purely were focused on cardiovascular, and that was 132 of those grants. Now, so obviously many of the NHLBI ones are cardiovascular, but there was also a lot that were pulmonary or other areas of focus. And then with HRQ, VA, and PCORI, these were across all clinical domains. And what we were able to get from the public data from these different funding institutes was, so we have data on who funded it, what the institution was, where it was funded, the investigator themselves. And then what we did was for each of these different grants, based on just the abstract of the grant, so it's obviously not a perfect way, is we went through and categorized what are the different methods that grant is using to perform their work. And then for the clinical domain, we looked at whether it was cardiovascular or not, and if it was cardiovascular, which clinical subspecialty within cardiovascular disease. And what we wanted to ask was what methods or clinical areas are being funded, and what are the gaps between the funded grants and then the current training opportunities and needs. And so as part of the survey that we did of the mentees and also the mentors, these same areas of methods, we asked them about if they had training in those areas and kind of their level of training in those areas, and then whether they desired training in that area. And so we're going to talk a bit the mismatch there and what that might possibly mean. So this is just going to kind of walk us through the slides. And so we're going to look at the breakdown, first of all, of successful grants overall, and then we're going to look at, so on each slide we'll look at all successful grants and then focusing down on the cardiovascular one and see if there's any differences there. And as I mentioned, we're going to look at all successful grants, and then we're going to take out the PCORI ones, so we're strictly looking at trainee grants, and then we're going to again focus on purely the NHLBI grants as an area of specific interest. And then we're also looking for areas of disagreement between funding, either opportunities or desires, and then what is getting funded. So here this is looking at all funding agencies, and in the blue here are the different kind of competencies related to comparative effectiveness research. So there's broadly clinical epidemiology, which is broken down into RCTs, practical clinical trials, systematic reviews, pharmacoepidemiology and observational research. Then there's implementation and dissemination, health economics, decision analysis, practice-based research, community engaged research or patient stakeholder engagement, health informatics, biostatistics, clinical guidelines, and communications. So there's a lot of different areas, and so here to focus on, to see really within all funding agencies, the clinical epidemiology is kind of those different methods are the ones that are kind of coming up most frequently in the funded grants. Specifically, if you look at the RCTs, 23% of all grants that were funded by these different funded agencies were RCTs. 41% were observational research. Not specifically in this case, but in other cases, each grant we checked all that applied. So something certainly could use, decision analysis as well as implementation research, or, that you can have different categories. Also, if you look at the last column, which was focusing on just the successful ones, again, in the successful cardiovascular, again, the RCTs, there's a lot of research there with 17% being them, and then 52% being observational research in the cardiovascular domain. The other one to note is the community engaged research or patient and stakeholder engagement. There's a lot of grants here, so 59% of the grants were listed as being related to that, and all successful grants, and then the cardiovascular 28%. Now, obviously, that's largely driven by the PCORI grants, where I think across the board, every single PCORI grant would be categorized as having some level of patient and stakeholder engagement. And so we'll show how that changes when we take out those grants. So the key points for the all funding agency was that really the areas within the field of clinical epidemiology were the most highly funded, and that it's the observational research and the RCTs are kind of the subcategories there, and that the community engaged research or the patient and stakeholder engagement was highly funded primarily by the PCORI grants, but that for this cardiovascular specific grants, it was less commonly funded than for the overall grant category. Now, when we wanted to look at the trainee experience and what they're getting trained in and how this correlates with the, what's being successfully funded, we looked at the areas where the trainees said that they had substantial prior training, and we wanted to see, okay, if they have substantial prior training, and where is their discord with in terms of the funding. So we looked at two ways of looking at this. Basically, if there was a greater than 20% difference from where they said they're being trained and what's being funded, and if then looking at a lesser one of the 10 to 20%. So there was no areas where there was a greater than 20% difference, but in systematic review and observational research, the trainees were saying they were getting substantial prior training, but there wasn't as much funding in those areas. If we looked at areas where the funding, on the other hand, was much greater than where they were getting substantial training, there was a lot more funding related to community engaged research and a fair amount more funding related to health informatics than where people were getting their training. If we looked at areas where the trainees said they would strongly desire training, so this is in areas where they're getting trained but where they want to get training, there was a large difference between that and funding related to practical clinical trials, implementation and dissemination, health economics, and then clinical practice guidelines, and then a smaller difference, but still a difference between RCTs, systematic reviews, epidemiology, decision analysis, and practice-based research. If we then looked at areas where there's a lot more funding compared to where people are saying they want to get training, again, the community engaged research, and then some of the observational research. We were trying to look across this, are there areas where people want funding, but it might not necessarily be where things are getting funded. Now, of course, what is hard to understand is that since we don't know kind of the methods of the whole group of things that are coming into, let's say, NHLBI, is there might be areas that NHLBI would really like to fund, but they're just not getting grants in those areas. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to grapple now in terms of thinking about how to actually move forward from this in terms of recommendations. So some of the key points there was that when you're comparing areas where mentees had substantial prior training versus available funding, that really this mismatch is the community engaged research, where there's a lot of funding right now and not necessarily prior training. And when you look at the strongly desired versus available funding, there's several areas where the desired training exceeds, at least right now, what's getting funded. And then funding seems to, as we mentioned above, exceed the desire for training related to this community engaged research. So we took out those PCORI grants, and really the thing here is that, obviously once you take out the PCORI grants, the percentage of grants that are funded related to community engaged research and patient engagement is much smaller. And so, but then it's kind of the same percentage that you're seeing in cardiovascular. Now, the thing to note is that if we remember back to who's actually funding right now, if we look at these early stage investigators, a large amount of the grants that are out there right now might be from PCORI, but whether that's going to be the case going forward, we're not sure. So some of the key points there is, if we remove PCORI, then it dramatically reduces the funding available for community engaged research. And it also seems to reduce that mismatch between all the grants and the desire. So if we look then at NHLBI as just the funding through there, again, the clinical epidemiology is really the methods that are used for the different research things. Again, the RCTs and really observational research is being funded by NHLBI with 55% of them of all successful grants being observational research, 57% of the successful cardiovascular disease. There is still a fair amount, even just looking at NHLBI, 16% of them have the community engaged research or patient and stakeholder engagement. And what we don't have here, and we haven't yet looked at, is since we have data from 2010 through 2014, we haven't looked to see kind of any trends over time and whether they're changing, since certainly our funding environment is changing quickly. I think we just talked about that. But in terms of looking just at the NHLBI, we again looked at the mentor or the mentees survey. There's a difference in terms of they're having a lot of training in RCTs and practical clinical trials, systematic review and implementation dissemination research. There wasn't any areas where funding was a lot more significant than prior training. But in terms of where they really wanted desired training, they have these areas here where they're desiring training and it's not necessarily, at least right now, matching up with what's getting funded. And in terms of funding, there's observational research is where there's more funding rather than where people were desiring training. But that might just be that the trainees feel that that's an area that they're actually getting enough training in. So, there was no areas of major mismatch between the substantial prior training and available funding. And really, there was these mismatch in some of these, the areas of having available funding and desired training. But, as I mentioned that, perhaps mentees feel that they might have adequate training in some of these areas. So some of the summary points we had from this survey was really that the observational research in RCTs were highly funded overall, and specifically by NHLBI. The community engaged research was highly funded overall, though if you only focus on cardiovascular grants or if you focus on non-PCORI training grants, that limited that. But the available funding for community engaged research appears to exceed the training that mentees are currently getting or wanting. And, NHLBI certainly is funding 16% of their successful grants focused on this, so either further training or a discussion with the stakeholders in terms of the value of that in a research training program might be needed. And then the mentees' desire for training appeared to markedly exceed the available funding in several areas, and it might be, it's difficult for us to say with this data whether any of these areas should be de-emphasized or whether we need to get people better trained in these areas to be able to submit grants that are stronger in these areas and actually then merit awarding by the different funding institutions. So really our next step right now, and where we'd love some feedback from the group, is really kind of if there are any changes that we should be recommending to NHLBI and other training programs, or how to really figure out some match between our training and then the opportunities for funding, and how to help junior investigators in an era right now where funding is pretty limited and might need to be focused on specific methods. And so that's kind of where we are now, and we'd certainly love feedback from the group. So I think that's it. We're going to move to discussion. Any thoughts or questions? How we can make it better for our junior investigators. Yeah.
I don't know if this is something feasible or doing, but you've looked at funding as a metric for success, but there are other metrics for success. Part of it, you're evaluated with things like, optimism and mismatch to actual, success in that sense. But something like publications, for example, might be a more tangible metric of success. I was wondering if that was something that would be feasibly evaluated, that could be feasibly evaluated here as sort of another comparison, especially when you're looking at that second objective where you're looking at sort of competencies,
right?
What's actually being, chosen for publication. Each of these have their own biases.
Right. No, I guess I'm trying to figure out how we could actually look at publications. So trying to figure out the kind of publication rate and the impact of those publications of early investigators. I don't know. I guess we could certainly look at, if we use as a sample the Q4 attendees. Those are people that we know, or the QCAR early investigator attendees, right? So we know that those are early investigators. And I don't know if we could look over time, how their publication. I mean, it's hard in a little way that, how to actually value the impact of publications, and, we can do it by impact factor.
Yeah, and certainly it's not the most perfect outcome, but you wonder if it just adds another dimension.
Yeah.
We can't hear that.
Metric.
We can't hear the question.
Yeah, so the question, and actually, do we have the other microphone? Yeah. The question was whether we could look at publications somehow as a metric of success rather than just grant success. And yeah, I mean, and so certainly like the slide that Prateeti showed there, it had the different metrics of success. We have, funding is just one way that you can measure someone's success. There's publications, there's promotions, there's job career satisfaction, work-life balance, there was kind of leadership roles. And so, all those other metrics we haven't looked at as a way to kind of define the successful. I mean, the other thing is we could try looking at it's kind of within some of the professional societies, some of the kind of leadership of those societies that are, I don't know how we could look at trying to figure out people that are succeeding within outcomes research. How are they being trained, and whether it's changing over time, and how to change our kind of training opportunities to match that. Yeah.
Gillian, so that was great. Part of the challenge is,
I don't know if it actually works, but we'll see.
Seems part of the challenge is taking kind of a relatively stale, antiquated set of data. And I mean, even the NHLBI, I think, fully recognizes that population science needs to be re-engineered with innovative methods and, getting beyond the old cohort studies and whatnot. And kind of looking towards the future. And I think we've been really good at that with some of the stuff that's going on. But so I guess the broad question is, how do you kind of integrate the idea that we need novel approaches of how do we better integrate kind of delivery of healthcare with ongoing evaluation of its effect, implementation programs, electronic health records, and big data, and how that, how we're using new techniques to understand that. A lot of this stuff is going on with the collaboratory and mini Sentinel and all these things. A lot of this stuff is going on, but I think for our trainees, that kind of being innovative and adapting to a rapidly changing healthcare environment and information is as important as anything else.
No, I mean, I completely agree with your point. And I think actually a lot of these funding agencies are looking for input, if you will, from leaders in these fields as to the best way to do this. I mean, yes, we NIH and others talk about pragmatic clinical trials and embedding clinical trials in registries and all these skills, but I don't know that they actually understand all the challenges involved in this and the nuances. So I think they're actually looking for guidance, if you will, from the collaboratory, as you pointed out, or PCORI, through the PCORnet, and as to the best way to do this. And as you know, now there are some efforts going on to try to do this, but we're having a lot of discussions even within groups of experts on this as to the best way to do this. So I don't know that anybody has actually created a model that that this is really the best model to follow or a good model to follow. And I think until those different aspects are better defined, if you will, I'm not sure that we'll have any tangible information to share with the funding agencies or to share with our trainees. I think this is still work in progress, but I completely agree with you. That's to me, that's where the future is.
Yeah, I think I'll just provide a little bit of background here. The amount of work that was very nicely presented here was actually sponsored by the NHLBI, who recognizes that there's a need to I like the word you use, re-engineer the training process for early stage investigators. I think they realize that the lesion lies on several in several areas. One is certainly the training that we provide early stage investigators, and actually some of the work that Gillian hasn't got shared yet has to also do with how training is done. I mean, the traditional thought is clinically it's like see one, do one, teach one, right? Or some of the sort of cohort studies that you've alluded to is pretty much here's a data set, come up with a question, answer the question, write it up, done. And there's not a whole, I mean, certainly we're training people to think about science and how to ask the right questions and learning methodology along the way. And there's certainly a didactic component to it, but we don't really have anything crystallized in our training regimen so far that focuses on, creativity or innovation or being able to pull in these sort of exciting trends within healthcare research formally into training. And I think that's one of the things that NHLBI realizes. On the back end, there's also a question of what's incentivizing early stage investigators to go that way. I mean, a lot of, let's face it, a lot of this is path of least resistance. The easiest thing to do is to get a little bit of seed money, go find a database somewhere and tap into it. And you'll get something on your CV at the end of the day. I'm being very cynical here. But that's the currency you do, because you try to get, because at the end of the day, you're going to leave your research 1 or 2 year research training or clinical training, and you need something that's very tangible to go find a position that is willing to either support you in the initial stages of your career, or you need to somehow bring something to the table that makes you appetizing to an institution in terms of sort of investing in that early stage investigator. And I think that's sort of another key piece that we haven't really tackled here yet, but it's certainly a big part of that recognition, is that how we re-engineer the development process in part focuses on the training process itself, but also a large part sort of trains institutions to think about how we invest in early stage investigators as they're coming out of training, or to sort of meet the needs of what we have. Galen?
Yeah, it seems like you're getting at this question about applying for funds, and so grant applications, and we have the trainees in many different specialties who are here at DCRI. To what extent are these trainees actually applying for funding during the time while they are trainees, for funding to be able to do their research? Is that typically happening, or not so often happening? Or because it seems to me getting that experience during training is quite key.
Yeah, we did ask, and so there's a bunch of data that we haven't talked about that we did ask. So we asked about both their optimism for the different funding mechanisms, but then also whether they had applied for those, I think within the last 3 years, and their success rate with those. So we do have that data. And then as Tracy mentioned, we also asked both the mentees and the mentors in terms of where they've been getting their training, like has it been formal classroom versus one-on-one versus short courses, and then also where they would like to get it, since that was an area that NHLBI was interested in terms of whether they could get some feedback on how they could help train investigators going forward.
There's an extra slide.
So what did you find? Did you find that in fact they are applying or not applying, or what number are, or what did you find?
I don't have I don't have it off the top of my head in terms of, we just got it last week, so I haven't looked at the data for that, whether they are. I mean, the thing is though, a lot, like a bolus of the people that we targeted and were able to get access to were these successful grantees, and so we do have a large amount in there that actually we know we're able to get some level of funding. But yeah, we haven't looked at that data yet, but we do have it.
Do we know how the NIH will be using the data from this work? I mean, have they seen any of this? Have they not?
They haven't, other than at the think tank, we presented some preliminary results, but they haven't seen it. I mean, originally, they, as you know, they were interested in looking at the unsuccessful grants to try to give us that next set of data, but that ended up not being able to work out in terms of confidentiality and stuff. But no, I think they specifically were interested in knowing about the mode of training that was interested. I mean, the one thing that we've looked at that it's hard to get at is when we're looking at these what's getting funded, there is also a mismatch by what the funding agency says they want to fund. So we tried looking at the funding priorities for these different funders and the types of kind of call for proposals and things like that to see if they have all these fundings that says, we really want to fund pragmatic clinical trials, and then is there a mismatch in terms of what they're funding and what they're getting as to where they say they want to be funding. But the funders, it really differs in terms of how concrete they are. Some funding agencies just say we want to eliminate cardiovascular disease. It's not really, and other ones are much more focused in saying, we want to use these specific methods. So it's a little hard to make those correlations. But. Okay. Question?
I'd love to hear from the early stage investigators sitting in the room to see if you guys are surprised by what your potential peers and or potential mentors are saying.
I guess I'm trying to figure out what the take-home message should be as someone who probably will be applying in the next year or so. And it does give some information about what gets funded, but it doesn't necessarily give you the percentage of total applications in those areas that got funded. And so I wonder if the high percentage of outcomes projects that got funded is just the tip of a very large group of applications that go out, possibly because for early investigators planning a project, outcomes research may seem a more straightforward path than a full randomized clinical trial, for example. So I'd be interested in, I know you don't have those numbers, but I would be interested in just seeing kind of what the fund lines are for these individual categories.
That's good. Yeah, because we had the funding lines, because the funding stuff that you did for NHLBI, that was all grants, not just training and grants, right?
It was all grants, yeah.
So it'd be wonderful to be able to, across these, be able to look at the ones that aren't funded to see, what areas they're focusing on, and it'd be nice to know whether if the things that are getting funded are because the underlying, is it really that these are great grants across all the different topics, and as long as you're writing a really strong research proposal on an important topic to get funded, or is it that, are there certain methods that are just really more receptive, study sections are much more receptive to, and so, whether we're training people appropriately.
I guess the other question is how much of the application is related to the project itself and how much is related to the applicant. And I'm sure you do have more data about the individuals that they've self-reported to drill down to what are the qualities of the applicants themselves that seem to correlate to successful application.
Yeah, and the other thing we don't have any information on is, the actual, how you actually measure the impact of these studies is, you'd love to be able to see, are these actually impacting outcomes, 10 years down the line or something.
There is a study on RO1s that came out recently where they looked at RO1 funded research through the NHLBI and what kind of impact it had in terms of where they were published in terms of impact factor and overall effect. And it was by, I forgot who published it, but it came out through the NHLBI about a year ago. And they basically showed that RO1 investigators don't always have the highest impact publications, and it's not a clear story.
Yeah.
So I wasn't shocked at all by what the mentees wrote. I suspect I would say something very similar. But I think you need to look at, when you're looking at success, you got to look at maybe some surrogate markers, as in which of these investigators are getting small wins, right? You get a small institutional grant, you get with the guidelines funded analysis. Those small wins are what are going to make us excited about moving forward and applying for K awards and R awards if we get that far. So I think you have to really look at these. Those are the things that are going to predict how well you do in the future and that you want to do well in the future. So if I get small wins along the way, I'm having fun, I'm writing papers, I'm going to keep going forward. If I don't get your small wins, I'm not going to move forward because I've lost. I have no wins in the column.
Well, that's
So
an
I think you gotta
interesting comment,
incorporate that data to, and that'll predict it, I guarantee it. I suspect the fellows that you see that are now young faculty doing well have won these small wins, and that's gonna predict that they're gonna continue to do well.
And I wonder, because I was surprised with how much more optimistic the mentees were about their funding than the mentors. But you're right, I guess if we look at the ones that are optimistic about that funding, if those are ones that have, the ones that all said, my own institution, yay, are those ones that have actually gotten some funding from their own institution in the last 2 years, and so they think this is going to continue, but the mentors think, that might not necessarily be the case.
And not just the institutional grants, but
Right.
there's other grants and again,
Right.
other awards that have fund analysis, even a travel award. All those things make us feel like it is possible. I have one. I suspect the same sociobiology goes on with people that play the lottery and get these small wins, and they go on to continue to pursue the big one, whether they can get it or not.
Yeah, and we could also look at, we could try targeting somehow the, investigators that win poster awards and things like that at the professional societies, kind of junior investigators that get some sort of level of award. Yeah.
That's an interesting comment, because there's actually been a lot of debate on, at least on the professional society end, about the utility of investing in these smaller seed grants versus what you get, how much career development you get from a seed grant versus maybe heftier grant that is more career focused and longer term. So I think that perspective, it's not, there's been debate about it. I don't think anyone has shown any data showing sort of what the long-term successes are of these smaller grants versus the larger type of grants.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to Adam's point, the AHA does those Young Investigator Awards. You could probably easily reach out to AHA. They have a whole list of the young investigators.
Yeah.
And add them to that thing. And to Tracy's point too, I'm on a lot of the AHA clinical work group calls, and that clinician volunteer leadership is very committed to that idea of that small young investigator award, which I'm not sure how much money is involved, but it does include a travel award. And they're always looking for opportunities to really enhance the mentorship that's part of that award, as well as to enhance the visibility of the work that results from that award.
Yeah, we originally were going to include the AHA in terms of our successful grants. We were going to include the AHA. I think it was the Doris Duke. In the end, those the names of the investigators is public, but the actual description of the grants wasn't, and so those ended up not being. But we could certainly target those investigators to get more information from them and maybe follow up on that. Yeah, it's time to go. So thank you so much for joining us.